Dear students, I am Professor S.I. Jukalkar from Department of English, Shri Shivaji College, Chikli. Today I am going to discuss in this video lecture the poem The Garden by Andrew Marvell. This poem is prescribed for BCom final year, semester 5. Let's know Andrew Marvell. He born in 1721 and passed away in 1778. He belongs to 18th century. He was an English politician and satirist. He composed poems on love, religion, patriotism, and nature. Marvell's poetry possesses all the qualities of metaphysical school of poetry, such as elaborate conceit, logical argument, concrete imagery, the dramatic elements, abrupt personal beginnings, and a clever blending of metaphors. Andrew Marvell's poetry are musical, and some of his well-known poems are To His Coy Mistress, The Garden, The Coronet upon Appleton House. Before reading the poem, let's discuss the abstract of the poem first, so that we can easily understand the poem when we start reading it. The Garden, first published in 1681 in a volume called Miscellaneous Poems. It is one of the most famous English poems of 17th century, as has since been widely anthologized. This is a beautiful example of metaphysical poems in which Marvell uses a garden as an extended metaphor on how one should live one's life. He dismisses the way we run after honor and acclaim and lose out on living life in the lap of nature. He finds the garden to be the place where the poet becomes very happy and leads very happy life. There is a rich system of allusions in the poem, and references are there that contribute to make up the poem with layers of meaning. Allusion particularly is a passing reference without explicit identification to a literary or historical person or place or event. Even biblical stories and biblical figures are also used by the writers in their works. That becomes allusion. Before directly reading the poem, we should first understand the form of the poem. The poem possesses 9 stanzas, and each stanza has 8 lines. The idea is developed step by step. We come across comparisons, allusions, and the metaphor of garden is dominant in this poem. So let's read line by line, stanza by stanza, and understand the poem by paraphrasing it. The first stanza, let me read. How vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak or bays, and their incessant labours see crowned from one single herb or tree, whose short and narrow word shade does prudently their toils upbraid, while all flowers and all trees do close to weave the garlands of repose. Here we find references to trees such as palm, oak, bays. These trees had great significance in classical traditions. The leaves of these trees were used to make crowns that were awarded to people who earned special recognition. The palm for military honors, the oak for political distinction, and the bay for poetic merit. So the beginning of the poem is very striking. Here the poet says, it is futile, it is useless to struggle hard in life to earn special recognition. So Why it is futile? He says that men simply go crazy in order to win a crown of the leaves of palm trees or oak tree or laurel tree for their military, civic, or poetic achievements. They perform unceasingly, endlessly labors in order to obtain a crown of leaves from a single tree or herb. The short and ever narrowing shades of these trees wisely rebuke such men for their hard labors, while all flowers and all trees act unitedly to weave garlands with their shades, these garlands being the garlands of rest and tranquility, and therefore far superior to the garlands of crowns of leaves which those men seek. So, in the very first stanza of the poem, the poet makes it clear that very hard labor by the men in the world to earn some distinction is useless. On the other hand, if we observe nature, the trees, they too work, but very silently and in tranquility they work. They work in loneliness and they create far better things than the people in the world who work very hard to achieve some distinction. So it is better, he means to say, that we should lead our life in tranquility, in the company of nature, and we should learn from the trees how to lead life and how to lead life peacefully. Let's read stanza 2. Here the poet personifies quietness and innocence. He, he calls quietness and innocence as sisters. He says, "Fair quiet, have I found thee here, and innocence, thy sister dear. Mistaken long I sought you then in busy companies of men. You sacred plants, if here below only among the plants will grow, society is but rude to this delicious solitude." As I told you, quietness and innocence are personified. Personification is one of the figures of speech used by the poet here. The poet uses very interesting combination of words as well. In the last line of this stanza, the poet says delicious solitude, delicious loneliness. So the poet says quietness and innocence, these are the two important qualities every human being should possess. The poet says that man should uh, lead his life in quietness and man should possess the quality of innocence. These two qualities are not found in the crowd, in the company of men, in the company of worldly men. Where do we find these two qualities? These two qualities, the poet says, he tried to find it out earlier in the company of people, in the crowd, but these two qualities are not found in the company of people. On the other hand, these two qualities are there in nature among plants. So, therefore, the poet is trying to tell us that the life in the company of nature is far better than the life we lead among the worldly people in the crowd. Stanza 3. In stanza 3, let me read the stanza 3 first. No white nor red was ever seen so amorous as this lovely green. Fond lovers, cruel as their flame, cut in these trees their mistress's name. Little alas, they know or heed how far these beauties hers exceed. Fair trees, wherever your barks I wound, no name shall but your own be found. So here the poet is trying to tell us that the company of nature is far better than the company of beloved. So here neither the whiteness of the complexion nor the redness of the lips of the beloved has ever been known to be so loving as the lovely green color of the plants and leaves in a garden. Doting lovers who are as cruel in their actions as the flame of love which torments them show their cruelty by carving the names of their sweethearts with knives on the barks of the trees. It is regrettable that either these lovers are not quite aware of or they do not pay enough attention to the fact that the beauties of the garden are far more attractive than the beauties of their beloveds. So the poet says, as far as I am concerned, O fair trees, wherever I happen to make use of a knife to cut into your barks, I shall carve no woman's name there, but only your own names. In the next stanza, that is stanza 4, the poet uses allusions here. He refers to Apollo, the god, which is the reference of this god is found in Greek myths, and the god Pan, the reference of Pan is also there in Greek myths. Daphne and Syrinx are nymphs. We find their reference in the Greek myths and legends. So here we find these two allusions. Apollo was in love of Daphne and Pan was in love of Syrinx. So that background is there to this stanza 4. So when we have run our passion's heat, love either makes his best retreat. The gods the mortal beauty chase, still in a tree did end their race. Apollo hunted Daphne so only that she might laurel grow, and Pan did after searing speed, not as a nymph but for a tree. So when the poet says, when our love has run its course and our passion has been exhausted, we can withdraw into garden for rest and refreshment. Or when Cupid, the god of love, is not actively at work to make people fall in love, he withdraws into garden for relaxation. The gods who run after earthly women whom they think beautiful find that their chase has ended in their getting hold of trees instead of women. For instance, god Apollo ran after the nymph Daphne not in order that he should hold a woman in his embrace, but he transformed. Similarly, god Pan hotly pursued the nymph Syrinx, not in order to satisfy his lust, but because he wanted to get hold of a reed into which that nymph was to be metamorphosized. So these are the two allusions we find in this stanza of the poem. Stanza 5 is like this. What wondrous life in this I lead! Ripe apples drop about my head, the luscious clusters of the vine upon my mouth do crush their wine. The nectarine and curious peach into my hands themselves do reach, stumbling on melons as I pass, ensnared with flowers I fall on grass. So in this stanza, The poet is describing the wonderful time he is spending in the company of nature in garden. What he says, what a wonderful time I am having in this garden. Ripe apples hang downwards from the trees so as to touch my head. The delicious bunches of grapes growing on the vines come into such a close contact with my lips as I walk that their juice enters my mouth. The nectarines and the exquisitely formed peaches come into my hands of their own accord without making any effort. The melons grow on the ground in such plenty that I walk on my feet, strike against them, and my walking is obstructed and entangled among the flowers. I fall down on the grass. The beautiful life of the poet, as he imagines in the company of nature, he describes in this stanza. When we go further to stanza 6. Stanza 6 reads like this. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasureless withdraws into its happiness, the mind that ocean where each kind does state its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that is made to a green thought in a green shade. The last two lines of this stanza are quite famous and often quoted, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. So the poet wants to say that we have to annihilate everything. We have to avoid everything, finish up everything that is made, that is artificial, for a green thought in a green shade. So we should lead our life in the company of nature, and natural things we should adopt. That is what we need nowadays. Due to the rise of pollution, there are so many diseases spreading throughout the world. So we have to lead a life which is which is eco-friendly. Eco-friendly life is what we need nowadays. So the poet in this stanza also tells us about the capacity of mind, uh, how mind creates, how mind is very creative. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasure's less withdraws into its happiness. So, what the poet wants to say is that he says, my body uh, remains on the grass, but my mind withdraws itself from the body because it is not interested in the lesser or inferior pleasures offered by the fruits. My mind seeks happiness of a different kind which originates from the mind itself. The mind is like an ocean where each creature living on land has a counterpart in water. However, the mind can also create altogether different lands and different oceans which quite surpass the real lands and the real oceans. The mind reduces everything that has been created to nothingness, giving rise to fresh and vigorous thoughts in the shade of a green tree. So, when man is in the company of nature, his mind becomes very creative and can think very great things. Therefore, we should lead we should lead our life in the company of nature. In stanza 7, the stanza 7, let me read. Here at the fountain's sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's moss root, casting the body's vest aside, my soul into the boughs does glide. There like a bird it sits and sings, then wets and combs its silver wings, and till prepared for longer flight, weaves in its plums the various light. Here, the poet imagines that he is close to a mountain. He is sitting, he is by the side of a mountain, and his feet are there in the wet. His feet are there on the wetness of the ground, and he is very close to some fruit tree. To the he but he imagines that he leaves his body there, and he turns his soul into a bird and then sits on the branch of the tree, his soul sits on the branch of a tree like a bird and sings, and then his soul preens and combs its its bright wings as a bird does, and finally, having prepared itself for a longer flight, weaves the manifold light in its wings. So the poet here imagines that he leaves his body by the side of the tree, and his soul turns into a bird and prepares itself for a long flight. It's very beautiful imagination, excellent imagination. Then in stanza 8, let me read the stanza 8 first. Such was that happy garden state, while man there walked without a mate. After a place so pure and sweet, what other help could yet be meet? But it was beyond a mortal's share to wander solitary there, two paradises there in one, to live in paradise alone. The indirect allusion here is of the Bible and the creation of man. The first man, Adam, is created first by God, and Adam was placed in paradise. First, Adam was alone. Later, Eve was created. So here the poet says, mm, here I find myself in the same happy state in which Adam was when in the Garden of Eden he walked alone without a companion. So the poet is comparing his life in the garden with the life of Adam, who was at the initial stage alone in the paradise. As Adam was happy in paradise, in the same way, the poet is also happy in the garden because he is alone, he is lonely, he is leading his life in the company of nature. When he found himself in such a pure and sweet place, no companion could have been appropriate for him, as the poet says. And he says that there are two gardens here. The poet is enjoying two gardens. The first one is the loneliness, and the second one is the garden like paradise. Therefore, two paradises there in one, to live in paradise alone, as the poet says at the end of this stanza. Stanza 9, the last stanza, let me read it. How well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew, where from above the milder sun does through a fragrant zodiac run, and as it works, the industrious bee commutes its time as well as we. How could such sweet and wholesome hours be reckoned but with herbs and flowers? See, here we find many reference to zodiac and then sundial. You can see that in the picture, and the when the sun rays pass through the trees, the shade, the shadow of the leaves is there on the ground. That reference is also given. So before the invention of clock, people used to find out time on the basis of the shape and direction of shadow, and at that time sundial was used to know the time of the day. And reference of zodiac is also there, we find in this poem. And second thing what is striking in this stanza particularly is that the industrious bees, honey bees, is supposed to be intelligent, and they also use they also understand the time of the day based on the shape and direction of the shadow that is created by the trees and the flowers. From the shade, the people in ancient time used to understand time of the day, and they used to plan their work. So, in this stanza particularly, the poet says that how uh, the gardener who made flowers and plants is skillful. Here, who is the gardener? God Himself, who has created the world, is the gardener. He says how the gardener is creative because on the basis of the shadow and the direction of the shadow and the size of the shadow, easily people understand the time and the patterns that is served by sundial also tells us the time. The rays of the sun fall on the sundial with a diminished heat after passing through the green leaves, which may be compared to signs of zodiac and the hard working bee, while artwork is able to calculate the passing of time as correctly as the human being can by consulting this sundial. After all, how could be passing of such a sweet and refreshing hours be calculated in the garden except by means of the sundial formed by plants and flowers? In other words, the poet wants to say that nature is everything. So we have to, if we want to be successful in life, if we want to enjoy life, we should lead life in the company of nature. Now let's understand the central idea of the poem. There are many ideas covered in this poem. The first one is the superiority of life, lonely life, solitary life to feverish activity. So it is, the poet says in the very first stanza we came to know that it is futile on the part of the men to perplex themselves by their endeavors to win a crown of palm leaves or a crown of oak leaves or a crown of laurel which they seek for their endless labors as a reward for their exploits on the battlefield or for their athletic achievements or for their poetic work. Men toil hard to obtain the leaves of the single tree, such as a palm, an oak, or a laurel, but the short and narrow shade of one single tree wisely rebukes them for their vain labors, because all the flowers and all the trees in a garden combine to offer to them garlands of repose. Thus, the poet criticizes a life of feverish activity in every sphere of life and recommends a life of repose in a garden in the midst of flowers and trees. Secondly, the poet dislikes the company. He doesn't want to lead life in crowd. He wants life in loneliness. The poet himself needs no crown of laurel nor his poetic labor. On the contrary, he finds quiet and its dear sister innocence in a garden. He says that he had for a long time been making the mistake of spending his time in the busy company of men. The company of human beings is barbarous as compared to the delicious solitude which he enjoys in a garden. Then beauties of women and the beauty of garden is compared, and the poet says that beauty of garden is far better than the beauty of women. He means to say no woman with her white complexion and red lips can be so loving as the green color of the leaves and trees in the garden. They are foolish and cruel lovers who carve the names of their sweethearts on the barks of trees and their knives with the knives. Little do they realize that the beauties of garden far exceed the beauties of their ladies. Then he also argues that even gods were in love of garden and trees. When he says, when we have exhausted our passion, or when our passion has spent itself, we take refuge in a garden in order to relax and take rest. Even the gods love gardens. When any god chased a beautiful earthly woman, he did so because she was a potential tree. For instance, Apollo chased the nymph Daphne only because he was to be transformed into the laurel tree, and Pan, the god Pan, ran after the nymph Syrinx only because she was to be changed into a reed from which he could make a pipe for himself to play upon. Then he describes fruits and flowers in the garden. Then, specially, he speaks about pleasures of the mind in the garden, how mind becomes active in the garden. That he tells, and that is more important. What he says, with his body lying on the grass, the poet allows his mind to draw happiness from its own resources, because the mind is not satisfied with the inferior pleasures offered by fruits and flowers. The mind is like an ocean in which the counterparts of all the creatures living on land are to be found. All the objects to be seen on the land have their corresponding images or ideas in the mind of man. But the mind possesses, in addition, the power to create lands and oceans quite different from those which actually exist on the earth. In this way, the mind reduces everything existing on the earth to the status of a green thought in a green shade. These are the very famous lines often quoted, I told you. In other words, a man lying on the green in the green shade of a tree gets into a vigorous contemplative mood. Then the poet describes also about the importance of and the pleasure of being lonely. The poet feels that his soul has left his body and gone into the branches of the trees, where it sits and sings like a bird, preparing itself for a long flight. The poet's soul here feels so happy that the poet compares this happiness to the happiness of Adam, who enjoyed his life of loneliness in the Garden of Eden before the creation of Eve. And then the poet also gives here reference to sundial. Finally, he says he admires the pattern formed by the flowers and herbs in one part of the garden. The gardener has made the flowers and herbs grow in such a manner that they serve the purpose of sundial. The mild rays of the sun filtering through the trees, through the leaves of the trees, fall on the sundial and enable bees as well as human beings to know how the time is passing and what the time of the day is. So, this is one of the very famous poems. Here I stop, and to prepare this video lecture, I have used some of the images. I have taken these images from Google Images, and the sole purpose of this video lecture is educational. It is not professional. Thank you very much.